Welcome back. A new report by Amnesty International says the South African government is failing millions who are living in the country's informal settlements. At the intersection of climate change and poverty, residents of informal settlements are falling victim to seasonal floods in areas such as Johannesburg, eThekwini and Cape Town. To tell us more about this report and its findings, I am now joined by Malavika Vartak from Amnesty International. Malavika, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. If you could just start off by telling us a little bit about Amnesty's report titled Flooded and Forgotten, seemingly an apt title.
Thank you so much, Masa. Thank you for having me on this show and for giving me the opportunity to explain a little more about our report. So this report that we published on the 4th of November is about informal settlements and underserved areas such as TRAs. It is a well-known fact that people living in informal settlements are disproportionately impacted by both major and seasonal floods. This causes massive destruction. We've documented many sort of incidences where people have lost their belongings, have lost, days of school, like children have had to miss school. People have had to miss days of work, and this is in the seasonal flooding. And then, of course, we've had the major floods like the recent ones in Eastern Cape or the 2022 KwaZulu-Natal floods where lives were lost. Or in February 2025, there were another rounds of floods in eThekwini where, again, many lives were lost. Now, what we see is that the response to this flooding is patchy and uneven, which only deepens inequality. And we just want to say that this report of ours draws on the huge body of work done by many civil society organizations, grassroots movements, institutions in South Africa. And it's our attempt at adding our voice to raising these issues. And with South Africa hosting the G20 summit shortly and prioritizing disaster risk reduction as a goal, we have a unique opportunity to sort of re-shine the spotlight on these informal settlements and underserved areas, and to make sure that there are robust disaster risk reduction measures put in place urgently. The climate crisis is real, it's happening, and sort of unseasonal rain, flooding is only going to get worse.
Yeah, and you know, as you're talking about climate change just being happening, there's nothing that can be done to avoid it in any case. I mean, just this weekend in itself, there's been warnings of adverse flooding that may take place, even possible hailstorms. And of course, we know that that will affect more so those living in low-lying areas and in informal settlements as well. And quite often we hear from government saying to people, do not build informal structures in these low-lying areas. But then we also hear from those people saying that, look, we don't know where else to put these structures, where else we can live as well. It seems a bit like a catch-22. What should be the sweet spot, if there is one, when it comes to this kind of situation?
You're absolutely right. I mean, most people who live in informal settlements are people who have been left out of the formal system because there isn't enough truly affordable housing for them to access, for people living in poverty to access this housing. As a result, people have to, I mean, there is no choice but to live in informal settlements. What we are saying through our report is that disaster risk reduction measures have to be put in place. South Africa, many, many years ago, embarked on the policy of upgrading of informal settlements. Unfortunately, this hasn't happened to the extent and with the speed that it should have. And where informal settlements, proper drainage could have been put in, adequate services could have been put in to sort of mitigate the impacts of these floods. So we are once again calling for prioritizing upgrading of informal settlements, putting in place proper sort of infrastructure, making sure that the housing where people live is is dignified, is safe for them to live in. So this is, again, something that our report makes a very strong call for. And through this, through building in climate change adaptation in these upgrading programs, gives us a better chance of protecting people who are the most vulnerable, who are the most marginalized in our societies.
And you know, a little bit early, Malavika, you mentioned, of course, the previous Eastern Cape floods and the KZN floods that we saw as well, devastating effects, also lives lost in that KZN flood too. But what we do know is that fast forward a year or two, a couple of months later, those people who were left in temporary shelters after those floods are still waiting to be relocated and moved to steady and proper homes. Now, this is a compounding problem because, as I mentioned earlier, this weekend alone, there will be more floods, which means more people will be left homeless and without their places to live, whether it be an informal settlement or a hard structure house. But focusing on the informal settlements themselves, if we still already have this backlog from previous floods, what are the chances that we'll be able to catch up on this housing?
Yes, it is not an easy situation, but I think there needs to be, I mean, and this is what we've been saying in our report, that South Africa, the government, all three spheres of government need to really act quickly and ambitiously to upgrade informal settlements where they can, to make sure that climate change adaptation measures are put in place. Of course, this cannot be solved overnight. And in the meanwhile, our report also talks about, having early warning systems, having systems where people can sort of shelter in emergency conditions so that they're not left stranded by the roadside, as we've seen in previous floods. Like, even if they've managed to get out of their homes, very often they're just standing by the road because there is nowhere for them to go. It needs to be an ambitious plan. It needs to sort of, and the South African government has an international obligation to use its maximum available resources to protect people's human rights, and this is very much a human rights issue. We also have seen that municipalities that are often on the front line on when it comes to housing, when it comes to essential services or basic services, climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction measures, they're often, we've seen through lots of literature that they're often underpowered and overwhelmed. So we are also calling on the government to make sure that they're adequately resourced, both technical resources, human resources, and in every way, so that they can meet this challenge.
In your report as well, it also reminds us of comments that were made by the Gauteng Premier in September of 2025, when he had announced that the office would embark on a plan to demolish newer informal settlements. And I think this goes back to the point we made earlier about sometimes government saying to people, do not build in these certain spaces. They will be prone to, adverse weather conditions and things like that. But that wasn't received too well either. What was wrong with those statements made by the Premier in an attempt, as it seemed, to try and hinder people from building in places that will in future cause harm?
It's a very unfortunate and a dangerous sort of a statement, because the answer to these issues is not to demolish informal settlements. In fact, the right to housing includes the prohibition on forced evictions, and there is a lot of literature. There are many laws and policies nationally and internationally to guarantee this. The answer really lies in addressing this issue by building sufficient affordable housing, by upgrading informal settlements, by making sure that there are proper measures, even things like stormwater drains being cleaned regularly, by putting in drainage systems. Even that can sort of support or mitigate the impacts of the climate crisis that we are seeing.
Malavika.
So we would very, very strongly call for sort of not going the demolition route. That would inevitably or often result in human rights violations, but in fact acting positively to upgrade informal settlements to, sort of guarantee the right to adequate housing.
And from a citizen-led kind of perspective, for those residents who are finding themselves living in low-lying areas because they felt they had no other choice but to build right there, what advice would you give those people?
It's hard to give sort of advice, to them, because obviously it's very clear that they're living there. And we spoke to many people in the three metros, and everyone was saying that they're living there because there isn't any other choice. The advice would be to them, but also to the general sort of population, to hold our governments accountable, to hold them accountable to the promises they to make sure that the integrated development plans are robust, to sort of follow these and to engage in these processes. But really, it's the advice is more for the government to put in place these measures. Um, the people living in the informal settlements are doing everything they can to protect their homes, including, I mean, many of them told us that they simply use buckets to get the water out. Sometimes they make little channels to divert the water. They use sandbags. There are lots of different initiatives by civil society, like the Asivikilani campaign. There's the Durban People's Plan on climate change adaptation and the right to housing. So I think on that side, people are doing everything they can. But of course, the duty, the obligation is of the government, and they need to really act quickly and ambitiously. It's not like they're not doing anything, but I think a lot more needs to be done.
Malavika, thank you so much for your time and unpacking that Amnesty report. Really appreciate it this evening.